What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to I Came with Fire podcast. Tonight we are here with the Cognitive Marine, as you can find him on his social media. Julian, thank you so much for joining us. I think everybody's going to really enjoy this episode because we are talking about some comparisons between Rome and the United States, which is a pretty common thing to talk about, especially anytime something goes wrong in the USA. Everybody loves to bring up how it's the fall of the West, like the fall of Rome and all this stuff. But anyway, Julian, nice to have you on here, man. Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself to everybody?
Yeah, hey, I really appreciate you having me on. I'm a Marine Lieutenant Colonel, active duty, and serving right now out in the Far East. And my career has, been an interesting one, like I think a lot of active duty personnel over the last 2 decades have been. But having served over 20 years, I've done the standard Iraq, Middle East, and global hotspot deployments. All of that has kind of given me a unique perspective as I reckon with all the experiences that we've had, shared and otherwise individual kind of experiences. And that's really what drew me to starting the platform that I did on Instagram, mostly because I found very quickly that, as is no surprise to all of your listeners, that most of the Marines that I spoke to, I maybe have their attention for 15, 20, 30 minutes. And then very quickly they would be on their social media for hours and be
For
far
sure.
more engaged. And so that's why I started the platform. And it's really grown since then. And kind of totally unexpected ways. And a lot of it has to do with the feedback that I get from the people that I engage with. And a lot of people have very strong opinions, which is great.
Mm-hmm.
And that has really shaped the kind of things I put out there, which is, I think, ultimately why we're talking here.
Definitely. Yeah, when I started this podcast, one of the things that I had planned on talking about eventually was talking about Rome in the United States. And when I saw that post you made a while back when I hit you up, I was like, here we go. Somebody that I can have a conversation with and jump on and do this.
Yeah.
And for everybody who's been listening to us, as you can see again, Zach unfortunately can't be here tonight to jump in on this conversation. He's pretty bummed out, but he'll be back next time. But yeah, I'm really excited to have this conversation with you because you seem really well informed on the subject, and it seems like you have a passion for it as well, which is something that I have too, is a passion for history.
Yeah, absolutely. Really, for me, the issue of Rome and or Pax Romana, as it's kind of typically known, is you're right. There's a lot of comparisons made between Pax Americana or the American Empire and the Roman Empire, and I would offer to you that they are certainly both empires, and they have done empire-like things. And what has really captivated me towards the Roman Empire, which is why you see it every once in a while, is because I literally see events taking place that I have read in Roman history.
Mm-hmm.
And they are, although on a different continent, produced by different language speakers, they are in effect the same leaders, the same situations. And Gerald Mattis has a quote he used to tell us often. I was a young second lieutenant in his division, and he would often visit with the most junior of officers. And
Wow.
he would tell us, if you're looking for a new idea, read an old book. And
I like that.
it stuck with me as a young officer. And from the very earliest days, he was a big fan of Stephen Pressfield, a guy, an author who I've come to know personally, and who is a former Marine, by the way. But Stephen is got, he's written Gates of Fire, amongst other books, and is a really phenomenal historian when it comes to the Roman Empire as well. And a lot of that kind of burned a bit of a fire in me about the Roman Empire.
Hmm. That's awesome. I think it's kind of funny because I mean, you're on social media through Instagram, but right now there's kind of a trend going around where women are asking their husbands or boyfriends, fiancés, how often do you think about the Roman Empire? And it seems to be that every guy, has the same answers, like, oh, once or twice a week or a couple times a month, or these long drawn out answers about why they think about the Roman Empire. So I think that's kind of funny. It seems to be a thing that all of us think about very often, but to go back to what you were saying, the parallels are kind of uncanny sometimes when you don't get too bogged down in the minutia, right? Because there's going to be differences. But let's consider up front that the Roman Empire was founded by dispossessed peoples from another empire, right? Which is
Yep.
very much the same story for the Americans. We were, this group coming over from Europe, from fleeing, religious oppression, come to the United States, or what would become the United States, and starting a new country. And then we were both yoked under the reign of kings before throwing off those oppressive kings. And republics were established. And our founding fathers, founded our republic literally on the backs of what the Romans did, right? And we
Yeah.
have this deep, deep hatred for monarchy and autocracy. So there's upfront just some very, very large comparisons, and you can keep going, right? And there's some markers throughout our progression as empires that seem to line up really, really well.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. I think if you the humble beginnings that Rome started under,
Hmm.
and where it's kind of whether you argue the five great emperors were the
Hmm.
peak, but I would offer to you that Rome had a vision towards the next generation and
Hmm.
viewed their empire as multi-generational. But not only that, but viewed themselves as as key benchmarks in the history of human civilization. That's why they
Hmm.
built things that would last thousands of years. Um, and there's and I'll give you an interesting parallel that I think is highly relevant to today.
Hmm.
Um, if you, I don't know if you ever walked through the Roman Forum, but it,
I have not, unfortunately.
yeah. So I have, and it's anyone who goes to Rome. That's about the only place, amongst other, there's amazing places to see, but the Roman Forum obviously is should be at the top of your Marcus Aurelius bucket list. But the Roman Forum uh, is amazing because it was clearly built for people 1,000 years from now to understand. And if you were to look at a society, you know, generationally, multi generations into the future, and you were to look back at maybe the one great creation, what would you pull from that? And I think the Roman Forum encapsulates that perfectly. You got the government, you've got
Hmm.
the area of the people, you've got their spirituality, all centered in this like central zone known as the Roman Forum. And that's not by accident. At least I don't believe, and I think the literature tells us supports that as well.
Hmm.
In many of the same ways, if you go to Washington D.C., you see the intersectionality of all of that. You have the government, you have plazas for the people, and then you got the spirituality piece where you see a lot of references to God, a lot of
Hmm.
references to religious icons and symbols, and that's not by accident. And I think the U.S. is also trying to project 1,000 years into the future. If we're going to build something, let's make sure it lasts.
Hmm. No, absolutely. I think that's the mark of all of these past great civilizations. You can say, not even just the Romans, the Greeks, the Egyptians, obviously with pyramids. Those were not meant to be gone in a couple hundred years.
That's right.
So they leave their mark because they do think progressively out in the future. I really like that you said that, and I like that you brought up how there is a focus on, or at least a centralization on religion. and something that gives people purpose outside of themselves. And I think that's something that we could talk about as well later in the conversation
Yeah.
about the disappearance of that as well when you get more towards the decline of the Roman Empire and some of the things that you could say are the declination of the United States, or definitely things that are on the downward slope, is kind of a loss on those religious tenets, or those tenets that provide purpose, whatever you want to call them, right? Because you don't need to be religious to have good principles. But you know, bird's eye view, right? Continuing with these comparisons, Rome had some global conflicts that it was involved in that generated wealth, and it made their economy boom. And the same thing with the United States. The global wars that we have been involved in. After the conclusion of World War II, the United States became the global hegemon. We had a common enemy for a long time with the USSR, but eventually that went away. And we have this mass influx of wealth into our economy, which kind of generated this disparity between what now we could say are these American oligarchs that do really run our country, and then a lot of poverty and civil unrest. And the same thing happened in Rome as well. And then you can say further, when you have civil unrest and poverty, you have a need for populist views to come about and generate change. And you can see that with the Gracchi brothers, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, in ancient Rome. And then again
Yeah.
with somebody like JFK. And then the comparisons there are both of the Gracchus brothers were murdered, and so is JFK. And then you now
Yeah.
kind of have another populist leader, somewhat, right, in Donald Trump. At least he rallies from some of those populist views of giving back to the people, taking and lifting up the middle class. But we've very much fallen into those oligarchical traps that the Romans did, and then eventually they became an autocracy. I mean, do you kind of see the United States heading down that road into autocracy?
Um, I don't know if um, if the United States is headed down into a path of autocracy.
Mm-hmm.
But I think, if I may, just start at some of the key points you just brought up, I think are extremely
Please.
relevant. So, Rome fights wars of empire. Rome fights wars of economy. Rome fights wars that are defensive in nature. They have
Mm-hmm.
no clear, definitive victor or loser. And so Rome does all these things. And what's interesting is that um, Rome, it isn't until later into the Roman Empire that Rome has that professional standing army that we've come to kind of known as the centurion and the legion. But the
Mm-hmm.
reality is that Rome for many years just has an army that is only created for the needs and then dissipates back into the either farmer or subservience. There's a lot of
Definitely.
slaves, and so it matches kind of well with the early start of the U.S. kind of military. And it
Citizen
isn't.
soldier.
That's right. And it isn't until we really get into the early days of World War One, or just prior
Mm-hmm.
to World War One, that we come to realize that having a large standing army is not just a requirement, but is an absolute necessary to our survival. Excuse me.
Mm-hmm.
And Rome experiences the exact same kind of convolutions. And it has a series of dirty wars along its borders in Germanica, as we, kind of popularly understand with Hannibal.
Mm-hmm.
But it also has these very indisputed wars in the Middle East that have no clear victors, that um, from the outsets are just shaping actions. And I would offer to you that um, during these very tumultuous periods, when some of these wars were not clearly defined. Let's just take Germanica and Rome's wars against Hannibal.
Okay.
The reality is that many of the legions came back. Like there was famously one was completely defeated and its standard was captured.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but not only that, but Rome feels like this pressure of, man, is this the end? Like
Mm-hmm.
we've had these strings of victories, and now we're being defeated by an insurgent in Hannibal. What's very interesting is that happens before the five great emperors as it's known,
Mm-hmm.
and really is like, as you can see, the mood in Rome specifically is just it's down, it's weakened. You're having slave revolts. You're having people take advantage of the situation on the edges of the empire, literally and figuratively. And yet, no one knows, no one realizes that the five great emperors are coming to really
Mm-hmm.
return Rome to this, like, to its kind of rightful place at the top of the food chain. And and in some ways, you're asking the kind of similar question. We've just had this disastrous exit out of Afghanistan. We are seeing economic turmoil.
Mm-hmm.
We are seeing wars on the horizon that none of us feel very confident about, and which leads to a lot of the kind of things I posed. What is, I think, most profound during all of that, to kind of get to your Trump question, whether this is a Trumpian kind of era we're about to enter in, or this is something else. And that's why I focus on Marcus Aurelius often. You know, what's interesting about Marcus was that he was an emperor in waiting since literally his birth.
Mm-hmm.
Um, all knew that he was going to be emperor, and his father-in-law, uh, or his caretaker, excuse me, his name escapes me, um, is basically sitting in the emperor's seat, waiting for Marcus Aurelius to come to power and be ready. He's too young, and it's wide acknowledgement that he would be overthrown if he was too young and inexperienced. And so they're waiting for him to kind of come of age. Well, he suspects it's going to happen in his 20s, early 20s.
Mm-hmm.
But the reality is that Marcus Aurelius doesn't become emperor of Rome and its kind of entirety until he is well into his 40s,
Mm-hmm.
which is kind of well aged in that era. You're to make it into your 40s is having survived the plagues, having survived getting robbed on the side of the street hundreds of times.
Right.
You literally fights for your life day in and day out.
Mm-hmm.
So what's amazing is that this transfer of power occurs to Marcus, and Marcus is kind of the the guy who takes Rome through the turmoil at the end of Hannibal's kind of reign there, and the defeat of Germanica and kind of the stabilization of Rome. What's
Mm-hmm.
interesting is that Rome enters a period of greatness because it's not fighting these wars for its survival, which I think is the most important thing here. Is that um, for us in the future, do we feel as if we are about to enter an era for the fight of our survival? Or can we find a period of peace so Rome can invest, or the United States can invest in all these things that we have come to appreciate, but really love? And that
Mm-hmm.
is what, like, Rome occurs, what occurs in Rome after Marcus Aurelius comes to power is that there are wars on the edges of the empire, and there are at times wars where there are. One could argue that Marcus Aurelius was at war his entire life, but
Mm-hmm.
there were no wars for Rome's identity or survival that
Mm-hmm.
occurred during his rule. There's these kind of small wars, if one could argue, and there were some big ones in there, but there was, generally speaking, they were not for all the marbles. They
Mm-hmm.
were not for Rome's survival. And I think this is the question that we must ask ourselves here: is that are we gonna enter into a period where everything is on the table? Um, and I think this is where the comparisons with Rome end. I think the the situation we're facing with China is in fact for all the marbles,
Mm-hmm.
and I think China um, intensely understands that this is that fight that has been kind of slow brewing, um, and this is and this is where the comparisons I think with Rome kind of end here.
Mm-hmm.
Rome famously split into two different empires. One that later became the Byzantine and
Mm-hmm.
headquartered out of that's really survived for almost another 1,000 years and out of Constantinople.
Right.
But the reality is that I don't see the United States splitting into two different empires and
Mm-hmm.
breaking apart. But I do believe that who sits at the top of the mantle here, whether China knocks the United States off, which obviously I'm against, or whether the United States is able to reassert itself as the dominant kind of hegemon in the world. I, what's interesting in this, and I apologize for continuing this line of thought here, but
No, don't apologize at all.
what's interesting is that Rome, during these period of five great emperors, uh, Rome has a number of things that takes off. One is like tourism. The other is arts and writing and science, and like they're able to invest in all of these things because of the relative peace.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the great things that comes out of this during this period is tourism, a form of tourism, and actually it's a pretty advanced form of tourism, by the way, where Roman citizens are traveling to what was to Greece to visit this uh, this Spartan people and visiting kind of what is we all understand to be is Sparta. And actually, we have the Roman tourists to thank for kind of rewriting about Sparta and about this great people. And the Romans really fell in love with Spartans and really fell in love with these people. And it was a frequent tourist destination for visitors to come and see people that had clearly chosen not to advance and
Mm-hmm.
chosen to be a warlike tribe. And um, the reality is that like experience for a lot of its Roman citizens set a high bar for what the government should be able to do and what the legion should be capable of doing. And I think in many ways, when we're facing this, and I believe a competition for empire dominance here in the next few years, I think that question resonates with the American populace. Is who does the American people look towards as kind of the benchmark standard bearers, and what does the American people ask of its military, which is the greatest that has ever existed, and what does it ask of its government, which is, one could argue, the most accomplished democratic government in the history of the Western world.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Roman citizens ask these same questions of its government, um, and I think Americans should be asking the same question of us.
I think you bring up some really great points, particularly the issues where you're talking about their populist issues, having the United States having to face some of its own identity crises that you're talking about that Marcus Aurelius and the Rome under him weren't really facing. The United States has to face those things, and we do have that that enemy at the gate in China, like you said, where it is for all the marbles. And to kind of turn the ship around, I think that again, those issues have to be faced with what the American citizen, the average American citizen, the middle class specifically, have to face. And I think it's interesting that you bring up Roman tourism. I had not ever heard of that before, and I think it's interesting that they go to a place like Sparta, which we're all familiar with, thanks to the graphic novel turned movie. But those are almost old school, old world ideals, returning to seeing how different sets of principles can bring about prosperity. And I do see a little bit, at least on social media, a turn towards the getting back to Western values and getting back to the things that we were doing before that made us who we are and made us great. Those values about family and purpose, and then trying to rein in some of the power that has gotten away from the regular American citizen. The same way, that power eventually got away from the Roman citizen. And then again, the what it meant to be a citizen in Rome is different than what it means to be a citizen in the United States. And one of the parallels I've always found to be really interesting about Rome and the United States is that at their advents, both the Romans and the United States were very particular about who they let vote. And I'm definitely not advocating for taking away the vote from anybody, but it does seem like the more egalitarian a society becomes, the more it starts heading down paths where all is allowed, all is permissible. And you start to see these degradations of values and principles that kind of upheld that society that these values were built on top of. So I think for us to get to that point where we can kind of have our tourism in Sparta moment is going to have to be where the United States kind of forces itself to face some of the issues that we have with the declining of our society, the centralization of wealth and power and oligarchs essentially, and then finding a common goal and that common enemy to face. Because let's face it, and just this is the way it is. I think is the hard truth of the world and people in general is you having a common enemy is never going to not be a thing, and it's always going to be a great unifier. And I'm not on here advocating for war. I'm not saying that, but I am saying that having a common goal is something that is going to bring people together to allow us to fix some of these issues. And it doesn't seem to go well when we fall apart that way without a goal.
Yeah. I think as you were talking, two things popped up in my head that I think are highly relevant here. One is that Rome was not destroyed from without; it was destroyed
Mm-hmm.
from within. And one could argue that Commodus, as soon as Marcus's son Commodus, just creates this highly destructive path that is kind of survives through the era. And I would tell you that the downfall of the United States, because of our strong military, is going to be from within. And I think you're seeing early indicators that whether it's manipulation through social media, whether it's a turn, and you see a lot of people within the United States turn to the things that we believe could save us, right?
Right.
And that is a natural tendency when we are running out of when you're running out of good options at hand. You tend to turn to the things that you believe can bring a strong correction, right?
Right.
So I'll give you an example. I'll oversimplify it. If you're hungry, a lot of people will go to a drive-through because we're trying to kill the problem right now. No
Mm-hmm.
one contemplates, hey, I should probably go to the grocery store because it just takes too long and it's
Mm-hmm.
just too hard. And I'm so hungry that I can't even think beyond the drive-through. Rome saw the same kind of issues that we're seeing today, and
Mm-hmm.
the natural tendency for people to, whether it is to kill your way out of a problem, whether it is to buy your way out of a problem. I don't, that's really a question that we will all ask ourselves. What's interesting about Rome is that Rome had a wide disparity of religions because it was, this amazing empire.
Mm-hmm.
And for the most part, Rome was fairly tolerant of basically every religion. Obviously, Christians were not well tolerated, famously so. So,
Sure.
but the reality is that Romans worshipped all these gods, and there was all these. It was awash with religions. The issue with Christianity is that obviously it claimed to be the one sole religion, which put itself at odds with Caesar. But the other kind of reality here is that Rome tended to overreact to problems. And so, and it reacted, when it did react to problems, it reacted far too late. Famously, Commodus watched Rome effectively burn to the ground um, because of the plague. There was the slave revolt. Famously, Commodus was late to react to the famine that plagued Rome, and really just was kind of asleep at the wheel. And
Mm-hmm.
this is,
Sounds familiar.
as we look at the United States, and we are now waking up to a reality where I saw a statistic where if you earned the max income possible since the birth of Christ, you would there would and you lived the entire time to today, and you were able to save every single penny you have ever earned, it would only get you about $3.8 billion. Would even put you in the top 100 richest people on the planet.
Wow.
And the reality is that we are in a new era of power, what it means to be powerful. We're in a new era of what it means to be wealthy, and we're in a new era of what it means to be influential. And I think that um, these are complex issues that Rome similarly dealt with at the kind of at the different phases. But very rarely in Rome did all these converge into kind of one moment. And I would tell you that um, this is the challenge that the United States is facing, is that we're having a convergence of all of these issues into kind of one kind of era. And I saw it as a Marine commander who has led Marines both in the battle and stateside as a battalion commander. I have seen the breadth and scope of issues that are all converging into kind of one moment. And what I would offer as well, I got to go to Jordan. I don't know if you ever been there before.
I have not.
Um, there's a city called Jerash, and
Mm-hmm.
it's in northern Jordan.
Mm-hmm.
And there's the actual Roman name of the city is called Gerasa, and it is probably the world's most intact Roman city that is most rarely visited. It is in the middle of effectively nowhere,
Mm-hmm.
and it's hard to get to. Um, and I basically have walked through that town at least 10 times. It's a massive city, Roman city that's abandoned, and you can have the city to yourself effectively. If you go early in the morning, you're the only person there. I guarantee
It's
you.
incredible.
And I've walked this city multiple times. Uh, Over the last 20 years, I've been able to go to Jordan many times. But anyways, there's this place in the middle of the city where it's literally a fountain that was built 2,000 years ago. And this
Mm-hmm.
fountain is, you could see the huge bowl that the water was spraying up out of. And we're in the middle of a desert, and it's always been a desert. And the Romans are like creating water fountains in the middle of nowhere. What's interesting is that Jerash, or Gerasa is the Roman name, was not captured. It was abandoned by the Romans.
Wow.
And you look at this city, and I'm not saying you can move in today, but you could certainly see a future where the Roman roads are still there, and they
Mm-hmm.
literally lead to Rome. And you think to yourself, like, the Romans abandoned the city. Like, what
Why?
internal strife could have like befallen that they would like fall back from these positions?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is a symptom of a disease, of an internal rot, where all
Mm-hmm.
of a sudden you lose your kind of the fear of being overrun, or the fear of of your lines connecting all the way back to Rome, and then you start falling back to better, more what you believe to be better and more defensible positions, but in fact that you are actually causing the very downfall you are trying to prevent. That
It's
literally
so.
what made Rome so great was that it was out on the edge of the empire.
Hmm.
And what makes America so great is that we are, again, at the edge of the empire, and our fears are the only thing that can make us fall back.
Right. It's so interesting the way you described it. The first thing my brain went to was thinking about the body's reaction to going into shock. Because what's the first thing that happens when your body goes into shock? It pulls all that blood in your chest. It moves away from the extremities to try and save itself, right? And
That's right.
that's exactly what you're talking about, is the Roman Empire going into shock and pulling all the blood, right, into Rome, thinking it's better positions. And it's just a natural reaction. I think it's interesting. That's what came into my mind. It sounds like the body's reaction to shock. But what you're talking about too is like reacting without enough time, reacting too late to things. There's a lot of things that we face in the United States that almost seem too late, to me anyway. I mean, is that kind of how you look at it? Do you feel that we've reached that point, the point of no return, or do you feel like we can, like I said before, turn the ship around?
You know, I'm a big fan of Meditations, and I'm sure you've
Mm,
read it.
I have.
Uh, and Marcus Aurelius has this great quote. He says, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he effectively says that um, whenever you hit a roadblock or you are running into a problem,
Hmm.
the problem becomes the way,
Hmm.
and we tend to and I think to answer your question about reacting late or not reacting energetically enough, well, whatever the scenario may be, I tend to believe that um, what happens during these moments of strife or pressure, whatever it may be, that we tend to focus or focus on all the periphery, where
Hmm.
all the other ancillary problems start showing up, and it quickly becomes overwhelming.
Hmm.
And we tend to start solving the easiest of the problems in hopes of getting at the harder one. And we tend to
Hmm.
overlook the harder ones because they're too hard to solve.
Hmm.
And I would offer to you that um, what made kind of Marcus Aurelius so great is that in Meditations he left us with Meditations kind of inadvertently. It was his private
Hmm.
diary that he wanted kind of. It was not written for anybody but for him, which is
Hmm.
really a remarkable fact.
It is.
Like
Yeah.
how well thought out this thing was, and he wrote it in Greek.
Hmm.
And he wrote it in Greek, which was like the philosopher language. So it's like holy cow, this guy's like writing to himself in the philosopher language because it's the better language to deliver philosophy to yourself,
Hmm.
which is really really remarkable. But um, one of the things I like about Marcus Aurelius is that his very stoic approach to all of the issues, which is how we got stoicism, obviously. But uh, I would almost offer to you that if we have a stoic approach to our problems, as complex as they may be, and as difficult and as challenging as they are, I think we would very, very quickly find that not only are most problems human made, but
Hmm.
only these problems are that only humans can solve.
Hmm.
And many of them are self induced. I would, to kind of switch gears here on you and
Yeah.
to kind of pull this. Over the last few days, I've been hammering Transcom. Transcom
Yeah.
is, for the listeners who don't know, is one of the kind of uh, global combatant commands, and they don't have a territory like CENTCOM or SOUTHCOM or INDOPACOM, but they're a functional command, as we call it, and their thing is transportation. And as you look at the kind of the powers that be, we have a number of laws that are preventing us from exercising what I believe is to be moving at the forward edge of the empire. We tend to have this fear, and so it's like pulling us back, kind of to use that same thing here. And my argument, my position is that we should be at the forward edge of the empire. We should be shaping, and we should be enabled to shape at the forward edge of the empire. And the best way we can do this is through having access to local transportation and bringing our own with our own ship drivers and our own equipment is not only inherently expensive, but it just kind of boggles the mind. One of the things about Roman roads that I found so amazing, having walked many of these Roman roads, was that they were clearly identifiable as like a Roman road. One, you knew no question that this was a Roman road. Two, the other remarkable thing is that they were with us. But the most amazing, they're with us today, but the most amazing thing about Roman roads is that they were all built with materials locally. So the Romans didn't try to like haul a brick from a kiln in southern Italy all the way to Afghanistan. No, they like used the materials and they bent the materials around them to their will and to great success. In many ways, I think that's what Transcom is really supposed to do at the edge of the empire for us, is allow us to bend and shape the things that are at our disposal to our will, to enable us.
Right.
And if it doesn't do that, at the edge of the empire, I gotta ask, what is the point of having that organization? If it's not that, then what?
Yeah.
And are we truly serious that we're going to haul a large container ship to the edge of the empire and expect it to do what we need? And I think that's a fool's errand. I think as an enterprise as great and powerful as Transcom, it needs to act as kind of Rome. It is enabling by not putting the onerous kind of restrictions of the most forward deployed forces. I think that's where we start to change the game if we do this. The Chinese are doing the exact same thing, by the way. They have fleets of roll-on, roll-off ships, or as they call them, ro-ro ships, that are literally built to military standards. I'll give you a great example. There's a whole bunch of ro-ro ships that are permanently stationed that service the Taiwan Strait and between major cities. And these ro-ro ships were designed to carry tanks. The way the weight and the reinforcement on the floors to how wide the ramps are and how strong the ramps are were all designed to carry tanks. And they built that with the intention at the very beginning. And the Chinese military has access to thousands of these, or hundreds of these ro-ro ships, and to thousands more civilian ships. And it's a very smart entrepreneurial way of having dual use capability. And I think that's like effectively, what Transcom's Title 10 a position as not only as the transportation integrator for the U.S. military, but a signer of priority. Whether it gets aircraft or ships or slow-moving aircraft or fast-moving aircraft or large ships or large aircraft, it's also the advocate to Congress on what needs to happen in order to enable this. So, my love with Rome is kind of multi-dimensional here. I would argue one of the things that Romans tended to gravitate towards was amazingly, just like we're gravitating toward Roman history, the Romans did the exact same thing with Greek history. The Romans loved Greek mythology. They loved Greek history. They loved everything about Greece, just like we are. And it's
Mm-hmm.
literally the same kind of scenario where we're like having this love affair with Marcus Aurelius and Roman emperors and the
Yeah.
legion. And you see like the Roman salute and the standard, the eagle.
Mm-hmm.
We've absorbed a lot of these things into our society. So when the Romans did the exact same thing with the Greeks, and one of the things that the Romans pulled from the Greeks was this thing known as, I don't know if you're aware, but it's we understand it as the Thucydides trap.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I don't know if you're
We've
how
talked
well
about it
aware
on
of it.
this podcast before.
Yeah. So um, are we in a Thucydides trap here, and with China?
Seems like it.
And I would argue that yeah, I mean I think there's a case to be made here for
Mm-hmm.
that, and there's stark parallels here with the Roman interpretation of the Thucydides trap. One
Mm-hmm.
is you have a land empire in China fighting what effectively is both a land and sea empire, and I would argue the war has kind of begun. We're in
Mm-hmm.
phase one. We're
Oh yeah.
really shaping the campaign, and the Greeks um, really kind of viewed the threats. And the thing is that they view the threats in a kind of state where everything's on the table. It's for all the marbles.
Mm-hmm.
But what's interesting about the the Thucydides trap and the fight that the Greeks really kind of embarked upon was you had two different empires that both played to their strengths, but
Mm-hmm.
also tried to fight to their weaknesses, which is really kind of important distinction here. And I would argue that the United States is a naval empire.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I would argue. Recent history would tell you that the United States is a land empire, but I believe we are an empire at sea. And where you stand on that will basically dictate the options that you have. And I would argue that there's no way, not impossible, but there's no way that the United States invades China. There's nothing there for us.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone who says different is kind of losing their mind or hasn't looked at the situation clearly. I think
I would
this
agree
is
with
a
that.
naval fight.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say that Greece viewed this same thing, was that their survival was from their navy.
Mm-hmm.
But what was interesting is that they chose to fight via land and play to their weakness. And this really caused a series of dramatic events for them. Same thing with Sparta. Sparta was a land empire. And the moment they started masquerading as a naval empire, they found themselves in dire straits.
Mm-hmm. I do find it interesting when you started talking about this. I just to keep with the Rome and U.S. comparison, I almost thought you were going to talk about Rome deciding to build a navy to go to war with Carthage, and just how much of the failure that they met in doing that. And they did it over and over and over again until eventually, as Rome overtook Carthage. And it's almost where there's a swap here where the Chinese have caught up with our navy by building ships, and they're getting better at some of these things, and they're adapting to their environment, and not almost, they are forcing the United States to adapt, almost choosing the battlefield, so to speak, which is not good. We should be dictating those terms. But playing to the weaknesses, the Romans overcame that, and then eventually Mare Nostrum, right? Our sea, the Mediterranean, was the Roman Sea, and they
That's
became
right.
that naval power. And so I just find it really interesting because there is a stark example of a country facing its weakness and doing it over and over again until it becomes successful. And so you could take that in two veins. You could take that as the Chinese understanding its geography and needing to have a strong navy, recognizing that the United States is the predominant naval power. And you can say, well, with the issues you bring up with Transcom, the Navy has these weaknesses, and Marine Corps in turn, that they have to and must overcome. And this is something we've talked about here, is when and if this happens, if we never get off the highway of the Thucydides trap, is the Navy and the Air Force are going to be the most important players here. And and obviously in turn the Marine Corps when I say the Navy.
Yeah.
Because there is not going to be an invasion of China, in my opinion.
Yeah.
I don't see how that is profitable. So, to me, when you talk about that, you hit on a lot of the points that we discuss very often, and it's good that you use your platform to advocate for some of those changes, because they could be, as you said, in that fight for all the marbles. It is the pivotal piece, going towards checkmate one way or the other.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. I think the one of the other challenges that uh, as we're going through this identity crisis, where we effectively have a U.S. Navy that has never shot around in anger, and never has not engaged in a gunfight, in a literal gunfight since you could scrape away maybe a little skirmish here in Vietnam, but I
Mm-hmm.
mean it's not in a little gunfight until the Korean War, or in reality is the World War II.
Yeah.
But I think what's interesting is that President Teddy Roosevelt, he was he was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy before he became president.
Mm-hmm.
And Teddy Roosevelt uh, understood that the U.S. was a naval power and used the Navy to the fullest extent possible, and built a great Navy and built a capable Navy that was able to influence things and change things. But he was also careful not to engage in a kind of a land war in Asia. You
Mm-hmm.
know, he was
Right.
careful about what the what the limits of American power was, and because we had such a powerful navy, we were able to reduce the size of the land forces. So we basically became this elephant, or excuse me, this whale during
Mm-hmm.
the era of President Roosevelt, and when we were surrounded by a bunch of elephants, and the elephants being these large land powers.
Mm-hmm.
And what America was able to achieve during the presidency of Teddy Roosevelt was a large investment into a domestic audience. We were able to shape the the situation overseas to our benefit,
Mm-hmm.
and there's like all kinds of examples. I'm not going to go into them all, but there's a great one. Um, and what is now known as modern day Libya, where an American socialite, a guy, he gets kidnapped, and there's actually a movie that was made about this called The Wind and the Lion,
Mm-hmm.
um, with Sean Connery, by the way,
Mm-hmm.
as the
Classic.
as the guy.
Mm-hmm.
But The Wind and the Lion is a great movie. Anyways, Teddy Roosevelt famously used the Navy to basically park offshore, send some maritime forces in, and help pressure the it was called the Perdicalis affair, but use the military to basically extract the rescue and the recovery of this American. But it's really a different philosophy. If you were to travel to most military bases today, I don't think you believe 1 second that we are a sea power. I think you're going to
Mm-hmm.
walk away believing that we're this massive land power.
Mm-hmm.
And so now it becomes inherently difficult to deliver that power overseas.
Mm-hmm.
And it's only getting more expensive and more difficult as the Navy is literally getting smaller before our eyes.
Mm-hmm.
So I think as you bring up a great analogy with Carthage. Um, I don't know if the parallels continue, because I don't know if we get multiple chances at China. I think we get one,
Yeah.
if we're lucky.
Mm-hmm.
And I think personally that by having a strong Navy, we avoid the catastrophic engagement that would kind of make it for all the marbles.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the Russians had famously had an engagement with the Japanese really at the turn of the century in the early
Mm-hmm.
1900s. It was a huge naval battle,
Mm-hmm.
and the Russians um, did not understand the foe they were fighting in the Japanese Imperial Navy.
Mm-hmm.
And when they had this engagement, it literally wiped their entire Asiatic fleet clean
Yeah.
and sunk all of their capital ships. Uh, and it basically was the catastrophic fight that they were hoping to win, but they should have avoided.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in many of the same ways, if we have a strong Navy that is highly mobile, moving at kind of to crisis, we are going to be able to avoid the catastrophic fight that
Mm-hmm.
that would be for all the marbles.
Mm-hmm.
And that's my fear is that um, not that any of this keeps me up at night because I have great faith in our capabilities, but my concern is that we walk into a scenario where we have to aggregate our naval forces and our amphibious forces
Mm-hmm.
for a large all the marbles fight.
Mm-hmm.
And we haven't had a chance to rehearse this. We don't know the scenario until it's presented upon us, and
Mm-hmm.
we don't know the depth of the enemy's capabilities. We don't fully understand the situation, and we kind of almost stumble into it, and that's my
Mm-hmm.
fear.
No, I believe me. This is a conversation we've had quite a bit on this podcast. Recently, we had another Marine come on and talk. He was a former intel troop and had this big conversation, mostly about the Navy. And if you haven't listened to it, you probably would find it really interesting. And I think the pair of you would have a really good conversation if we brought you both on at the same time, because that's generally his focus. But my fear as well is that we're going to get quote unquote, caught with our pants down essentially by not being able to adapt to something happen insofar as taking a punch and reacting when we take a punch. And that's my concern. Not to get too far off the topic, but let's have this discussion, right? What are your thoughts on, carrier strike groups and your thoughts on these Dongfeng anti-ship ballistic missiles? Do you feel that moving inside these island chains closer to China really is off the table with those? And if so, how do we overcome that to be able to project power closer to that region and win this fight should that happen?
Yeah. So I think the question really boils down to what kind of Navy do we have? Do we
Mm-hmm.
have a blue water Navy or do we have a brown water Navy?
Mm-hmm.
And that's a distinction. That's an important distinction because the ships you have with a brown water Navy are small, littoral,
Mm-hmm.
fast. They can pack a punch, but not a catastrophic punch. The force you have with the blue water Navy, like carriers and strike groups,
Mm-hmm.
is you could certainly deliver a massive punch. It's still not catastrophic. So you would need to aggregate more of these ships, more of these carrier strike groups in order to have that catastrophic punch at sea.
Mm-hmm.
But now, and the great benefit is that you have mobility, but now these intercontinental cruise and ballistic missiles
Mm-hmm.
now come into play because you're in a very mobile area, or
Mm-hmm.
you're in a very target-rich environment. You're at
Mm-hmm.
sea in the deep blue water, and there's not enough other traffic around you in order to help mask your presence. It's pretty
Mm-hmm.
clear that you're there. The great news with the brown water Navy is that you're in and amongst local traffic, so targeting becomes extremely hard. Plus, you have terrain masking. You have this terrain that's all around you
Mm-hmm.
that provides some semblance of aid. There's only so many ports you can pull into with a carrier strike group. So all these factors come into play. But to really answer your question, I believe the Navy is overinvesting in the carrier strike group, the CSG.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's relevant, it's important, but I think ultimately that a CSG today is kind of like a battleship during World War II.
Mm-hmm.
The we built all these capital ships to fight this big war, but very quickly we realized that this new thing that was on the horizon in the fast attack carriers, that we were mostly converted battleships early on, and then quickly became converted tankers, and then quickly became purpose-built carriers by the end of the war. The reality is that we quickly realized that these battleships were not that important. That to the success of the fight, that these carriers were, and that these
Mm-hmm.
fast-moving cruisers were extremely important.
Mm-hmm.
Famously in the Sulu Sea and the Battle of the Coral Sea. I mean, obviously Coral Sea was a carrier fight, and then the Sulu Sea was a cruiser fight, and heavy cruiser fight. The reality is, are we making the same mistake now, where
Mm-hmm.
a carrier is kind of at the end of its life cycle, and is there a new ship that is around that we should be focusing on?
Mm-hmm.
Some would argue that that is a submarine for us, and if you kind of look at the way the Navy is investing, they're putting their money where their mouth is. They're putting all the marbles in the new Columbus class submarines.
Yeah.
The Navy is also investing in, I do believe they should be investing in the cruisers, which they are. But the question is, are these cruisers going to survive in a kind of fifth gen fight? And those are questions I really can't get into here. But the problem with the carrier fight is that you have to be so far out in order to launch safely,
Mm-hmm.
which now becomes a fuel problem, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which the Navy's answering by the unmanned wingman
Right.
program, which is
Air
refueling
Force
program.
too. Mm-hmm.
Yep. And but the other question comes in, like, what kind of ordnance could you deliver on carriers that are on aircraft that are flying so far out that they're going to be flying into a really saturated A2AD environment?
Mm-hmm.
So like it really becomes like, is the tail wagging the dog here?
Mm-hmm.
And and it's a fair question that the Navy is wrestling with, and I think they're having an internal kind of fight here. But the reality is that we're all counting on them. We're
Mm-hmm.
counting on the Navy, and in my own personal beliefs here, I believe that in this scenario, more is literally better.
Mm-hmm.
That the Navy is overinvested in these exquisite platforms that they can't risk losing,
Mm-hmm.
and what we need is simple, cheap, effective vice the complex, expensive, and dynamic.
Mm-hmm.
We really need kind of I won't say like the old Victory ships, but we need to flood the zone with really capable seamanship,
Mm-hmm.
really integrated weapon systems. And if we're able to do that, then I think that, by flooding the zone, we're able to be in places and not have this catastrophic kind of engagement, or
Mm-hmm.
all everything's on the table. Because the reality is, I don't know if you want to go to war with a Navy that is untested. Ours and the
Mm-hmm.
Chinese. If you look at this from the Chinese position, it's an untested force,
Yeah.
and they haven't been punched in the face, and they haven't experienced the cost of battle, and they haven't experienced a fight where you're trying to fight and battle damage. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
like battle damage on a ship is catastrophic. Like, are
Yeah.
you still in the fight at that
Mm-hmm.
point? And the answer is mostly no.
Right.
You're just trying to get out of there and try not to sink.
Hmm.
So I think, as the Navy wrestles with these kind of very important questions, it has to contemplate all of this and be very careful about the future it chooses. It just may be the kind of future you want to avoid.
Mm. You definitely bring up some pretty relevant and scary points. To be honest with you, those are it's disconcerting to think about when you consider our littoral class ships are ones that no one really believes in, and the ones that we are actively trying to get rid of in favor of something better. You know, I wish I could have somebody come on and talk at length and in depth about submarines, because that's something that really interests me, because I do also am in that camp of thinking the submarines and our ability to wage submarine warfare is going to make a massive difference, especially with some of our allies in the region. But to me, this all seems to be coming to the point where we have to make a decision to change, adapt or die. Essentially, is kind of where it seems like it's going, and I feel like we're at that point. And the bureaucracy that you kind of talk about as well on social media is what's killing all of this, and that's why I think platforms like yours are so important, because like you mentioned before, you see all of these young Marines, and I see it too. I've seen before, with airmen, soldiers, they're on their phone. And that's what they're looking at, and you're reaching them at their level, which is exactly what you should be doing. And I think that's why conversations and accounts like yours are so important, because you're elevating these issues and reaching them there where they're going to see it. And then hopefully, right, if the DoD can fix its retention issues, um, you know, when they become leaders, they can make these decisions as well. But hopefully we have that time to make those decisions, because it certainly kind of doesn't seem like we do have that time. And we've reached that point where things have to change. Things must change.
Yeah, I think you bring up an important point about what people, whether you're active duty, reserve, National Guard, or thinking about joining or having retired, um, I would offer to you this, that and especially to all of your listeners, which obviously is a highly intelligent group based on the kind of conversations you guys have had on this
Oh,
platform. This
thank you.
isn't your random Joe just listening in. Uh,
Sure.
uh, but the reality is that I would not despair, because the although I am bringing up many of these kind of issues,
Hmm.
they are certainly fixable. And the fact is that even if none of these things were fixed, I believe we could find a way.
Hmm.
Unfortunately, I can't tell you who, but a general officer once told me, and I asked him about a very kind of influential,
Hmm.
very kind of guy is in a key position of leadership right now. I asked him a question about China, and he said the
Hmm.
first thing is that the Chinese are not 10 feet tall,
Hmm.
and they don't have the lessons of war that we have.
Hmm.
And I agree with him. Um, I also
Valid
agree
points.
that, yeah, I also agree that the Chinese, I believe that they don't want war with the United States. In my
Hmm.
heart of hearts, I believe that they're not a warring society. I believe the government, the CCP, has made some strategic errors in assumptions, and this is
Hmm.
causing us to be on a collision course. And I believe
Hmm.
the United States, should is challenged to deliver uh, its message about what it seeks in the future. And the president has often said that it's not the United States doesn't aim to go to war with China. And I agree with that wholeheartedly. I think if
Hmm.
I was to sit with my counterpart on the Chinese side, I would tell him, like, hey man, like, we got to find a way, because I think war is not good for anyone. It's
Hmm.
not good for anything.
For
And
sure.
um, that doesn't mean I'm not willing. Obviously,
Hmm.
as a red-blooded American, I think if the chips are down here, like that, all Americans should pick a side, and our side is the right side. Like
Hmm.
that's our perspective.
Right.
Um, But going back to what the average Joe thinks and why it's important we have these conversations is because the more informed you are about, like, not only warfare and what it means to go to war and the historical kind of aspects and the gravitas that all of this encompasses, I think you come back with a better feeling about where we currently sit.
Mm.
And I am often asked about many of the negative aspects about the United States military, about where we currently sit, about our fears and concerns. And these are all, like, believe me, adequate questions, and I love them.
Mm-hmm.
But rarely am I asked, how do you, about the very kind of strong points that we possess.
Mm-hmm.
Here's an interesting analogy, and I'll leave you with here.
Okay.
So I recently completed a master's degree in British naval history, and part of my dissertation was written on an island that was similar to Taiwan for the British. It was
Okay.
thousands of miles away.
Mm-hmm.
It was really a naval fight was the only way to achieve victory there, and it was very close to the enemies. It was like 60 miles or so away from enemy shores, the enemy that
Mm-hmm.
wanted that island.
Mm-hmm.
And so the British, in London, domestic audience was like up in arms, like, this is ours, we should have it, like there's no way this should fall into the enemy's hands. And this is during the age of sail, by the way, during the 1700s. So what's interesting is that the Britain lost possession of this island. They were soundly defeated 3 times. Yeah,
Wow.
3 times. And after the final time, they gave up on it.
No.
And during one of the times they lost this island, the defeat was so bad that it shocked London and the voting, or the domestic audience, that Parliament initiated court-martial proceedings against the naval admiral that was in charge of the fleet, the task force.
Oh, wow.
Not only that, but they found him guilty during a year-long trial, and his family, his descendants, by the way, are trying to clear his name to this day.
Oh, my gosh.
But they found him guilty, and they shot him on the quarterdeck of his ship in Plymouth, in Portsmouth.
Wow. I've never heard of
So,
this.
yeah, this was the British effort to gain control of Minorca, and Minorca being part of the Balearic Islands off the coast of Spain.
Mm-hmm.
And France had easy access to Minorca from its massive fleet headquarters there in the Mediterranean, and the same thing in the Spanish had access to this island. But the
Mm-hmm.
Spanish were the weaker power, and France was the stronger power, and was easily able to snatch Minorca away from Britain. The reason why Britain wanted Minorca was because Minorca possesses the world's largest inland natural harbor in the world.
Wow.
And so Britain wanted this place. You got to look at the history. It's incredible. So Britain fought these wars to maintain the island, and ultimately they lost it. That's why the only base today is in Gibraltar. During the treaty between Spain and England, this treaty gave possession of 2 Spanish islands to England, Gibraltar and Minorca. And there was all these conditions that were attached to this treaty, but bottom line is the only one England possesses to this day is Gibraltar.
Mm-hmm.
But the reality is that what's lost on the public in 1730, when England loses possession of this island for the last time, is that England was about to embark on the greatest maritime era in human history, and literally Pax Britannica, but crescendo within the next 30 to 50 years. I mean, literally,
Mm-hmm.
uh, um, Admiral Nelson achieves victory at Trafalgar in 1805.
Mm-hmm.
And like that's the height, one could argue, of British Empire, which would last for over 100 years.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't until like Winston Churchill's like, tacit acknowledgement that England had passed the mantle to the United States.
Mm-hmm.
So even in the loss, as catastrophic as Minorca's loss was to the British like identity,
Mm-hmm.
little did Britain know that it was about to enter this era of great maritime power, of greatness economically, of greatness internationally, where
Mm-hmm.
literally the Commonwealth would spread and gain in greater influence.
Mm-hmm.
That this was just a moment in a long history of empire.
Mm-hmm.
And actually it wasn't even like downward spiral, it was the upward.
Right. So are you kind of implying that should something happen between China and the United States with Taiwan, that it could just really be a platform for springboarding the United States even further if we lose that fight and the sort of face we lose with the rest of the world?
So the I think I'm more making a generalization about what history has taught us.
Mm-hmm.
I think what's important to pull from that entire statement and that storyline there is that one, none of the fights that England had for
Mm-hmm.
Minorca was for all the marbles.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it wasn't like every ship, every, it felt that way. It
Mm-hmm.
certainly felt that way. But the reality is that from the Admiralty in London, Minorca was this like, their view was that this was just a moment along the blip, just like England's loss of the United States, the
Mm-hmm.
colonies, was
Right.
like kind of part and parcel to the winning and losing of empires. So I think mature empires have this like grand strategic vision of the future.
Mm-hmm.
I certainly believe Taiwan is important as in line with kind of U.S. foreign policy here. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I believe in a free and open Indo-Pacific and all the things that make Taiwan important to us. Um, I think it's important that we have the kind of navy that
Mm-hmm.
it isn't that loss or winning in Minorca isn't like of Taiwan isn't for all the marbles.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying?
I
Like
get what
it's
you mean.
not so catastrophic that it's like, for instance, I give you, a better example. Businesses all the time shut down factories, but very rarely, or for your average Joe, if you can't afford something and you accidentally overspent, it isn't gonna put you out on the street. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Right.
Like you should not be in a scenario where a night out could catastrophically, render your future unlivable.
Right.
So, in many of the same ways, we should never be in a position where loss or a scenario should mortgage our future,
Mm-hmm.
and we should
Essentially,
have the kind of navy that could survive that.
mm-hmm. So essentially, you're saying the measure of the maturity of an empire is not in all of its wins, but essentially how it can take a punch and keep going, even if that means it loses some, right? You can't win them
That's right.
all, right? I mean, I think that is the most realistic approach you can have to being an empire, right? Pax Americana, like you said, because it is unrealistic. You can't predict everything that's going to happen. You certainly can't control all of the outcomes to be wins, and that's something that I think that every empire will have to face at some point. And because the concept of empire is never going away, I don't see, some large global rule essentially, right, with one, all of us as one nation or something crazy. So to sit here and say, this maturity of the American empire, quote unquote, is that we can take a punch and keep going is definitely a hopeful outlook on that. without sounding defeatist, I'll say.
Yeah, yeah, I agree, and I think the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan taught us that. You
Mm-hmm.
know, um, however grotesque the loss was, and
Mm-hmm.
the setbacks we experienced there, and the pain experienced, that
Mm-hmm.
no, we should never be in a situation where loss of something should be the loss of everything.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's important that we have that kind of vision,
Mm-hmm.
because you will begin to build a navy and a strategy around that.
Mm-hmm. I think too. You bring up, Iraq and Afghanistan, just talking about GWAT in general. Maybe to wrap this up and kind of pull back in some of these comparisons as well, is that when the Roman military went to war and it was at the fringes of its empire and came back, one of the things that it brought with it were a lot of slaves, and it kind of replaced the middle class worker there and the citizen, right, from being the person responsible most for economic prosperity. And the United States has kind of done something similar, where we've outsourced all of our labor essentially, and we do have slaves from around the world in other countries doing things and creating things for us. And that happened when they returned back from war and found a Roman society run less by a republic and more by, the elite, wealthy class, essentially, which is kind of what we have here with a lot of the corporatocracy that we have in the United States. And I think, fortunately for us and unfortunately for Rome, I think that we can see that, and kind of to your point about using a something as a punch to come back and rally from. I think that we can use those lessons of the past and essentially see what happened to Rome, and avoid them as a roadblock in the road to get out of the way, or to where the obstacle is the way, kind of like what you said, and learn from it and be better, be different.
Yeah, I think that's a powerful statement there, because as Americans are kind of waking up to what they're seeing in the media and what they're seeing in
Mm-hmm.
news, one of the things that Romans citizens, or Roman soldiers and centurions kind of experience, was that they would return to Rome after being decades overseas.
Mm-hmm.
And what did all that cost them?
Mm-hmm.
Well, it cost them a lot, but they also gained citizenship into uh, to being a Roman, and they gained land, which was like
Mm-hmm.
inherently valuable.
Right.
Um, and so the Roman soldier was well respected in Roman society, and it was the easiest way for anybody to become somebody.
Mm-hmm.
And what is interesting is that in many of the same kind of ways, the American military has afforded many current Americans pathways to kind of the experience of becoming an American, and the
Mm-hmm.
exposure of becoming an American
Mm-hmm.
to Americans. And so I think it's a good thing that we've become this nation of immigrants, and then we're finding people to put in uniform wherever we can. Recruiting right now is a difficult challenge,
Mm-hmm.
but the reality is that it's giving a lot of people a fast track way to the American experience. And
Mm-hmm.
I think if you meet somebody on the street who is maybe was born in a different country, but they tell you, but you can quickly engage with them and realize, okay, this isn't your average whatever race.
Mm-hmm.
This is a guy from a different path. And
Mm-hmm.
if you have that kind of military experience, then there's obviously a natural bond there. But I would also offer to you that those of us that have served in the military and had these experiences both in Iraq and Afghanistan and throughout the
Mm-hmm.
GWAT, we have a unique perspective of American power that even the political and financial elite do not have.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a powerful thing to have that experience and to have that common bond with what is millions and millions of your fellow Americans who have served in uniform. There is
Mm-hmm.
a minimum now within this population group. There's a minimum baseline of capability there, and I think that's a great thing. And I think
I
the
agree.
future looks bright because of that. If we didn't have that, this would be a separate challenge.
No, I totally agree. And yeah, I don't know how much time you have left. Don't want to keep you if you need
Yeah,
to get going.
yeah, I got to
But
wrap it up here.
cool. One thing I will say is one of the things that when I've had this discussion recently with a friend about some of the comparisons between the United States and Rome is that when Rome started integrating a lot of the barbarian tribes into its military is kind of when it saw a lot of its decline because you had people that didn't understand what it meant to be a Roman citizen and they were not bought in on the idea that is Rome, right? And that's something I think that is uniquely different between perhaps the Romans and the United States. Is that as Americans, we have a very strong identity of what we think we are and what we know ourselves to be. And joining the military is a very great way to ferment those principles and ideals into somebody. And where perhaps the Romans integrated barbarians into its, and not calling immigrants barbarians, but I'm using that term, the way you would historically,
Yeah,
right? That it saw a decrease in their lethality. I think that for us, if using that as a way to increase our numbers and then also increase a buy-in into our country as in creating citizens that way, I think would be a good thing, whereas it wasn't with ancient Rome, in my opinion.
yeah. I think there's a great modern parallel today. The French Foreign Legion
Mm-hmm.
um, does they basically is effectively comprised of mostly foreigners
Mm-hmm.
who don't speak the language, are escaping from a differential past, and are probably not your ideal candidates, frankly, for the military
Sure.
because of all those things. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
that would be a non-starter for the U.S. military. What's
Yeah.
interesting is that France has made the French Foreign Legion like a centerpiece of their defense strategy.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but this isn't the only
Interesting.
example. Uh, Globally, you have in Nepal, you have the Gurkhas, and
Mm-hmm.
you have the Indian Gurkhas as well. You have Nepalese Gurkhas, you have Indian Gurkhas, which have been
Right.
absorbed into the British military and the Indian military, same thing, and the Pakistani military have these elite units of foreign fighters, effectively,
Right.
is what they are.
Right.
And they're still with us today. And what's interesting is that I've met many a French Foreign Legionnaire, and then I've met many of, I know plenty of Gurkhas. I've served alongside some, and I've
Mm-hmm.
spoken to many, and British officers who have led Gurkhas, by the way. Um, and what's interesting is that uh, it's it's a process to
Mm-hmm.
become not just a Gurkha or a legionnaire. It's a
Mm-hmm.
process to become a French citizen. And the Gurkhas, imagine this: a Gurkha's dream is to become a British citizen.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's a remarkable aspect of what it means to be
Right.
a soldier.
Mm-hmm.
And you aspire, like, man, that's amazing that people would be willing to put their lives on the line, especially in Afghanistan. One was a recipient of the Victoria Cross for famously
Mm-hmm.
defending his checkpoint against an onslaught.
Right.
Um, but the reality is that, like, man, we live in an era where people want to come to our country and become part of our, not only our militaries and all that
Mm-hmm.
that entails, but become a citizen. And that may not be the best route to having a great nation, and but I think if done correctly, if done well,
Done correctly. Mm-hmm.
it does it's an additive aspect of your nation. And
Absolutely.
I think it we have to be careful as kind of military service members. I think we've learned, if you've done enough time in the military, that um, who is good and who is weak,
Mm-hmm.
who is strong and who is fast, and who is tough
Mm-hmm.
and who is any of these
Right.
things is you know you would be walking on very thin ice if you came into a room of random Joes,
Mm-hmm.
military Joes, of all walks of life, of
Yeah.
all backgrounds, and you made wide generalizations. Because you
Yeah.
know in your heart of hearts, like when you walk into that room, like you know all that doesn't really matter, right?
Mm-mm.
Because it's a there's a grinding aspect that shapes you into kind of what you are.
Yeah.
And we all know the kind of tricks of the trade and the the inside scoop and all the hidden movements of what it means to be in the military.
Mm-hmm.
But at the end of the day, it's I often am walking into rooms of people I don't know. That is a
Mm-hmm.
hell. I'm about to do this here in the next week, and
Right.
I'm telling you right now, like I've learned over the course of 20 years, some of the toughest fighters I've ever met were people unexpected.
Mm-hmm.
It was an unexpected assumption on my part. And then
Mm-hmm.
two, I remember I served in Ramadi with these Iraqi soldiers, and I've had these generalizations about Iraqi soldiers, but I was
Mm-hmm.
serving with a group of Peshmergas,
Mm-hmm.
and these dudes had been at war for decades,
Yeah.
and these guys were tougher than woodpecker lips, man. Just like hardcore, dude, hardcore.
Love it. Love it.
And um, one guy that I was serving with was a damn near cancer patient for 2 years, and not even like a complaint. Like this dude was
Wow.
dying, and
Wow.
just like guns up, ready to go. Let's hit it on patrol. Didn't matter, anytime, any day. And
Epic.
yeah, just like holy cow, man. So I think as we are exposed around the world, I think we're going to find that, um, you know, there's all these unknowns, man. And that's one of the things I love about this conversation is that I've learned from you, and hopefully your listeners have kind of learned more about me and my position and my thoughts.
Yeah.
But I appreciate your time.
No, thank you for coming on. And I think that's a great way to wrap it up because you definitely nutshelled some of the best things about being in the military and then in turn kind of highlighted a lot of the strengths that our military has. And when you're in the military, like you said, those things in your background, they don't matter. It's who you are left to right, who's on your left and right. That matters. And that's what's most important. So, thank you so much for coming on with me, Julian. Also, perfect name to talk about Rome, right? You have a
Yeah,
very Roman name. So, but
that's
yeah,
right.
no, thank you so much for coming on. Good luck to you. I would love to talk to you again, and definitely stay in touch on social media, man.
Yep, you got it. Thanks.
What's going on, Fire fans? I Came with Fire podcast is sponsored by Red Clover Coffee and Sheep's Clothing LLC. Red Clover Coffee is a veteran-owned company with small batch roasted coffees, and they just happen to donate to some pretty awesome charities. Whether you're into specialty flavored coffees, single source coffees, or having a really cool coffee mug and some badass slaps, Red Clover has you covered. You can order ground, whole bean, or even coffee pods and get it all at 10% off your entire purchase using coupon code Came with Fire. Again, that's 10% off your entire purchase using our coupon code Came with Fire. I personally love their Blueberry Invasion and African Roast. That Blueberry Invasion hits the spot. Head over and get yourself some awesome coffee and support us by supporting our sponsor. I Came with Fire podcast is also sponsored by Sheep's Clothing LLC. Sheep's Clothing LLC is a unifying banner for all violent arts, disciplines, professions, and survivors of violent circumstances. Redefine violence. Both Zach and I being survivors of violent circumstances and LEOs in the military, we are especially excited to be able to offer you 10% off your entire purchase with coupon code FIRE10 at checkout. Whether you're looking for an awesome t-shirt, hats, slaps, flags, or MMA gear, they've got you covered. Me personally, I love my snapback with the leather patch surrounded by God's flannel. If you know, you know. That's coupon code FIRE10, FIRE10 at checkout for 10% off your entire purchase. Thank you all so much for supporting this podcast. And if you should feel compelled, treat yourself by supporting our sponsors as well. They truly make a difference for us. Now let's make a difference for them. See you on the next show.